Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you're enjoying National News Literacy Week and the many events that we're hosting in honor of this year's theme of solving the local news crisis. Before we begin today, I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. My colleagues, Ali and Tori, will help moderate the session, and we'll be dropping NLP resources throughout the presentation. For this webinar, the chat has been disabled, but you can ask questions using the Q&A feature. I promise there'll be time at the end for your questions, but because we're kind of tight on time and there's a lot of things to get through, I will politely ask that you hold your questions to the end. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us for this conversation. So, a little bit about me. I'm Demario Phibbs-Smith. I'm a journalist and a former marketing and communications professionals. I've worked in newsrooms like the Chicago Sun-Times and a number of digital media startups. Now I follow trends in news literacy with an eye on relations to marginalized communities and how to help amplify voices from marginalized communities. If for some reason throughout today's presentation, I'm not able to get to your questions at the end, you can always reach out to me at my email address on the left here, dphibsmith@newslit.org, and I promise I'll get back to you as promptly as I can. Thank you. So let's begin. So before we start our dive into what news is and how to find local news you can trust, I want to quickly touch on some key tenets of news literacy for people who might be unfamiliar or who are just tuning into this series for the first time. News literacy is the fundamental skill in today's information-driven world. It's about your ability to evaluate information and recognize standards of fact-based journalists, right? At its core, news literacy teaches people not what to think about a particular source, but how to think, right? What choices are you using to evaluate what sources you rely on? It's really taking people to have, instead of having this cynicism about the news and believing that nothing is worth reading, it's helping drive them into having a healthy skepticism and being more critical of the quality of information that they encounter. So to break it down simply, news is information that's meant to inform you, ideally through fair and impartial reporting about local news, international things, issues, people of note like celebrities, athletes, and politicians. Now, when we think about credibility for news sources, if you ask me, Demario, what sources can I trust? Well, we really got to start with what credibility means to you. And we can look for credibility at news organizations through the 7 standards of quality journalism. These are things like citing multiple credible sources, avoiding bias and causing the least amount of harm possible, documentation, fairness to present all sides of a story, verification. Is this organization using fact-checking and verification practices to ensure that their work is accurate? And then as well as balance and context, presenting things in the right light and getting the context correctly, talking about people in the right terms, describing issues and people correctly. Now, if we were to look for these things, for these signs of quality journalism, there are some things that we should pay attention to. If you're looking for transparency and you're trying to see how transparent a news organization is about its practices, what its diversity is, some of its editorial decision-making, you want to look at things like who reported the piece and when. Great quality journalism has bylines. They show you who reported it, when, and often where they reported from. Another thing to consider is things like, where is this information coming from? Is the evidence that's presented in this article, is it hyperlinked online, right? If this is a digital article, reputable news organizations nowadays typically hyperlink to the original source or other source documents. And then you also want to think about things like what type of relationships the news has with the subjects in the story. And if you want a detailed look at this, you could check a news organization's handbook, their About Us page if it's digital, or one of their ethical guidebooks to understand what stances they take on certain issues and what standards they try to adhere and commit to. You can learn a lot about these things. You can learn things like what happens when a source has a personal relationship with the reporter. What happens when reporters accept hospitality from sources, right? Things like speaking at or participating in rallies or other types of demonstrations, right? And then another thing that we think about when we look for sign of accountability is signs of quality journalism, excuse me, are signs of accountability. And a big way to look at this is through corrections. Typically speaking, we think that when a journalism organization gets things wrong, that they did a terrible job, and a correction is just an indicator that they are not great at their job. But really, corrections are a way to show people that, hey, we got this wrong. We own our mistake. We aim to do better. This is below our standards, but we'll do better in the future. That's a way to show people how committed they are to the job and how committed they are to being accurate and fair. So with all of the information that we see online, it is understandably really hard to distinguish what's real from what's fake, right? And this is why understanding journalism standards and why that's important to how you evaluate news organization is important. Misinformation is everywhere. It affects the way how we think about policy. It affects the way how we talk to our loved ones. It dominates some of our national discussions. And when we engage in, spreading misinformation and misinformation becomes viral, this can lead to us undermining trust in our trusted institutions, right? And cause harm to communities and relationships between communities and institutions. Most people can agree that the average person really does struggle with identifying what's credible journalism and what's just a viral rumor. So to think about, to really understand news, we have to really be able to distinguish what news looks like, right? And not to be redundant, I'm sure we've all seen news in some way, shape, or form, but maybe this serves as a gentle reminder and some things to look out for when we're encountering a news article. So one of the things that the biggest thing that you'll see on most articles is the headline. And the headline is the ideal way to present information, right? It's the first thing that you see. Often it's pithy and short, and it has a short selection of words, maybe 10 or fewer. They're your first look at what makes this story attention grabbing, right? They're the first thing that kind of connects you to the story. Next is the dateline, the byline. You want to check for this to show, this shows where this was reported at. And in this case, this is important because we see that it's reported in London, but we're talking about something that happens in Iceland. Also, you'll see the byline, the author's name. This you need to be able to see so that you can check this author's work to look for signs of bias or to just get caught up on the things that they write about, right? To learn more about them as a reporter or to go more in depth with some of their reporting. So within the body of a paragraph, the first two graphs or the first graph, or sometimes the subhead, will be the lead. And the lead of the story typically includes the most important information. You might hear that journalism is written in an inverted pyramid, where the most important information goes up top. So you'll see oftentimes just a short blurb kind of summarizing the story, but not giving you everything, just the big bits and pieces, and you can read more as you go on. In the body of the article, you'll see quotes and facts, the evidence that are included to make this credible, right? Where did you get this from? Where do you know this information? Oftentimes, in a credible news report, you'll see quotes and facts attributed to the sources and the people who said these things. Also, news articles are typically written in third person voice, third person with an active voice, and it's supposed to be written in a way that's non-emotive, right? You don't want to make anything sensational or to editorialize news articles, news reports. So I guess a question to really ask yourself, if you want to know if something is biased, or if you want to know if something is news, you can ask yourself, in this instance, can you determine if the journalist is for or against commercial whaling? If you can, this is not typical. This is not hard news reporting. It's another type of information. Hard news reporting is typically trying to inform you. It's trying to give you basically the 5 W's, the who, what, where, how, or sometimes age, of a thing. But we have to be careful, because a lot of this information looks like news, but it has different intents and purposes. So, as we talked about, news is meant to inform you, right? To give you information about a major event or a person. But there's about 5 other different types of information that we have to be aware of when we're in the information landscape. The first, opinion. Opinion and news can often look very similar. News and opinion look similar because oftentimes news organizations literally cover news, and they often offer more context with opinion articles. So it can be easy to confuse these two, especially when they're not labeled correctly enough. Another type of information to be aware of is entertainment. Oftentimes, entertainment can have the look of news, right? We see these shows like The Tonight Show or The Daily Show that might have more educational leanings, but their main intent is to entertain us, is not to inform. They may have elements of news in them, but they're meant to entertain us. Another type of another type of information to be aware of is advertising. Branded content, or what's known as native content in the advertising world, is designed to look like a news article, right? These are advertisers who take ad space on newspapers or news platforms and design their advertising to look like a news article. Then we also have raw information, and this is the unedited, undoctored version of some type of video, a body cam video, a video of a bystander taken from their phone, any type of evidence that haven't been altered. But it might be missing the important context, right? You might not completely understand what was going on with this. And then lastly, the last piece to talk about is propaganda and misinformation. We see this everywhere. We see this with memes. We see this on social media. We see this in advertising, right? We see this a lot. And this happens when propagandists and partisan parties use fabricated claims that look like news to manipulate us. So a key principle of news literacy is to be able to differentiate the news from opinion, right? Being able to understand that news is meant to inform you, while opinion is inherently biased, right? Oftentimes, like we said, news looks like opinion, right? And to be quite frank, at times journalists don't do quite good enough of a job of letting people know the difference, right? So we have to think about, a key to this is thinking about the word choice, right? The difference is that news is trying to give you the 5 W's. Its purpose is to inform you, while opinion is inherently biased. It's trying to influence you. So when we think about news versus entertainment, news programs and late night shows might have similarities in format and how they go about talking about the program, but they are distinctly different in their purposes. News programs are trying to be fair and objective as possible and be balanced in their reporting. While entertainment shows information, but with a little bit more context, it might be more partisan or might lean a certain way. So when we think about news versus propaganda, on the right, we have a blog post that's just riddled with false claims that is designed to look like a straight news report. It claims that based on information from a publicly available database of reports of post-vaccine health issues, the COVID vaccines are killing an estimate of 1 person per 1,000 doses. But this is entirely incorrect. It is not real. It is false. It is fabricated. And the news article on the left actually debunks the claim and puts data into the proper context. The article notes that through May of 2023, only 9 deaths have been connected to COVID-19 vaccinations, all from blood clots associated with the vaccine that is no longer available. So again, we have to be careful about the information that we encounter. You want to be very careful of things that use sensationalized language, right? Journalists are trying to be fair and balanced, so they will try to present a story in that fashion. Bad actors don't have these standards, right? They're not looking to do that. They're trying to manipulate your emotions, so they'll use language that is emotive and sensational. So also, when we think about credible sources of news, we have to remember that they only publish verified information, right? Things that are fact-checked, that are vetted, that are backed by evidence. Good credible sources also provide the relevant context and background on a subject. So sometimes this might look like multiple stories on an issue. It might look like long form investigative reporting. It might look like different angles on the story, right? But they try to give as much context as possible. And then they also avoid bias through fair and accurate reporting, right? They want to get the story right and to provide the elements of the story in a way that people can understand is fair and is balanced to the parties that are involved. So when we're thinking about signs of credibility, another thing to look for is vocabulary, right? And when it comes to fairness and accuracy, balance, fairness and accuracy, vocabulary is very key. So let's try just a quick reflection activity. Which of these headlines about the death of former US diplomat Henry Kissinger is more biased? I'll give you a few seconds to consider it. You can drop some guesses some guesses in the chat, or you can just keep it to yourself if you would like to. Just give you a hint. Just really focus on this one. Think about it for a little bit. Don't just jump to your first assumption. Think about this for a minute. Okay, so I'm sure there's a number of people that went with what is turned out to be the Rolling Stones article on Henry Kissinger. I'm sure a number of people probably thought that this one was the most biased, right? It's literally probably the most like condemning of someone, right? It's literally calling him a war criminal. While the political article refers to him as a diplomat who helped reshape the world, right? But when we think about these things, we also have to consider that how we talk about people is incredibly important. Henry Kissinger has a very complicated and nuanced legacy, right? Although he's never been indicted criminally for anything, he has also played part to some very horrendous atrocities that has killed thousands of people. So in history, it is important that we're very honest about how we're describing people, right? Because journalism is a document of the past, is a documentation of the past, of events that we lived through. So even though it sounds like Politico was being more fair, perhaps they were just being neutral in the terms of experiencing a neutrality bias, right? Trying to appear so fair that they actually didn't cover this possibly in the right light. Depending on who you ask, some people might say that they didn't cover that in the right light. They weren't being honest about who Henry Kissinger was. Another thing to think about when we're just looking at headlines, right, is the word choice and the tone that's presented in these things. Taking something, if we hone in on the word war criminal, right, and how it's used in these headlines, one uses a couple of these uses the quotations, right, the quotation war criminal, right, versus the Rolling Stones article that doesn't use the quotation. And oftentimes in journalists, as a journalist myself, we would use quotes to indicate that someone called him this, right? A source that you talked to literally labeled him this. During your interview process, they called him that. But maybe a conversation about bias might also lead you to think about if that really is a good way to, not call him a war criminal, right? Because just by including that word there, even though someone else said the indictment of it is the implications of it, I should say, are just as impactful, right? Just by associating him with this word, you kind of do the same damage. So these conversations about bias and the way that we use words and tone are very nuanced, right? And you can take certain things from a lot of things. But when we think about some other words to also focus on, especially in this politically charged time where we're seeing a lot of polarization nationwide and worldwide, here are some words to also be wary of that might carry legal or ethical implications. A rally versus a riot, a demonstration versus a protest, labeling someone a child versus a teenager, girl versus young woman, conflict versus war, and another, especially in these times to consider, is terrorist versus militant, right? The way how we use words and the context in which we use them really do mean a lot. But bias is also how we, is baked into the way that we see the world. It's a part of our worldview, right? The things that we see, we are influenced by how we feel about them, right? Our internal processes, our internal cognitive biases about things. But when we look at bias in the world, we oftentimes only talk about the bias that works against us, but rarely do you see people talk about things that are biased in their favor, right? And so when we think about this polarization, right? Well, how bias is used to manipulate us, how our biases are used to manipulate us, it can kind of explain why people are so openly partisan and why there are so many extreme views in this time. So when we think about our bias, you might see them in work through two cognitive functions. One is selective exposure, where you get your news and information from sources that you curate, right? From things that align with how you feel about the world. Versus selective avoidance, where you intentionally exclude certain things that you don't want to read that have an opposing viewpoint to what you actually believe. And then there's also the issue of hostile media perception, right? Which is a theory in mass communication that individuals have a tendency, individuals with a strong attitude towards an issue have a tendency to perceive media coverage as biased against their side and in favor of the opposition. So you really want to be careful about how you perceive the news and how some of your biases play a part into your perception and your news consumption behaviors. Decisions that you're making about your news sources might come down to your perception of bias, how it presents in the media, what you think about certain news sources, and on a passive, in a passive way of that, algorithms reinforce what our preferences are, and we have to be careful about not just passively consuming news, because we can end up in a filter bubble or an echo chamber where people are discrediting any information that goes counter to what you believe, right? And it stifles constructive dialogue. It prohibits people participating in democracy, people having good conversations, good discourse about their differences or the way that they see the world. So before I let you all go today, I want to leave you with 3 tips for staying informed, right? For finding news that you can trust. The first is to be intentional. The second, analyze any false and misleading information that you see online. And then the third, act as a trusted intermediary for those around you, your friends and loved ones. We'll break this down in a second. So the first, to be intentional. It is on us to diversify our news sources. It is on us to take the responsibility to make sure that we are getting a more complete version and a more complete understanding of news and broad ranging issues. When possible, verify information by comparing it to a number of reliable sources, right? Using other news sources that you trust to cross-reference it, to figure out if this is something that you can also trust as well. And then a lot of this work comes down to the questions that we ask ourselves, right? Instead of closed-ended questions about bias, think about more nuanced questions about bias and the lines of what's more or less bias. And then another important thing that we can all do is to support quality journalism, right? Support local news efforts that are happening in your backyard. Support and subscribe to news outlets because the news industry needs your support. So according to Northwestern's local news initiative and the State of Local News report, it found that there are 204 counties in the United States with no news outlets whatsoever, and there are 1,500 counties with only one. And the crisis that is happening in local news has been going on for quite some time now and has been getting worse. We are at a critical time for the sustainability of news, of local news. So some stats from the local news report was that they found that almost 3,000 papers closed or merged since 2005. And in that time, the number of journalists that have been employed have decreased by 60%, which means almost 45,000 people are without jobs, right? There are 45 less reporter and editor jobs on the market. And although most of the papers that have been lost are in metro areas, big cities, the rural counties have experienced the most harm to their news environment. So I just want to leave you all thinking that, understanding that there is news that you can trust. Although we might not think about all these sources in this way, the truth is that there are plenty of new sources of information that you can trust, covering things from your elections to your local community centers to events going on around you. There are things that you could plug in if you so happen to be in one of these communities that do not have a news outlet. So one of the things you can check out are newsletters and email subscriptions from elected officials, right? A number of small towns, they keep up the word of mouth, and the best way to keep up the word of mouth at times is, now in today's digital era, is something like a newsletter, right? You could tell all your constituents about what you're doing. So check out those and subscribe to your local elected officials newsletters and email subscriptions. Also, news services from universities. When I first got my start as a reporter, I started at my college newspaper. We were one of the only daily newspapers in the country. And we had a circulation of like 15,000. We were like the second biggest newspaper in our area. And so we carried ourselves with adhering to journalism functions and journalism principles the same way journalists do, except we were students. We had a professional advisor, a former journalist and editor, who would advise us on our stories and our meetings and how we conducted and ran the paper. Another thing to look out for is city or county government websites, right? To really learn about what's going on around you, it is a great source to learn about what's happening in your community. You also want to check out things like public broadcasting, right? Your local PBS affiliate or NPR, they do great news coverage of a lot of things that are happening, and it's really easy to access. Community groups and neighborhood websites also help tell you about what's going on around you. And then if you can't find any traditional news sites around you, you also have non-for-profit news organizations who are trying to reimagine what the relationship between community and newspapers look like, or news organizations look like. So in the line of being intentional, you want to do a few things. Be mindful. Understand that there are different types of information. Their purposes are each separate from each other. Also, be proactive. Be deliberate about getting your news and don't rely on algorithms. Thirdly, be critical. Actively look for signs of this credibility. Evaluate news organizations on the standards of quality journalism. A key question to ground yourself in is this information trying to inform me, persuade me, or manipulate me? The second thing, analyze false information and misleading information. So some things to think about when you see misinformation, you might see certain tropes, things like outrage and fear and conspiracies and denialism. And they're often in certain trends, right? We see this with pandemics, for instance, or elections, or around celebrity deaths. And you will see this play out in the form of screenshots or pictures that have false context through made up captions or doctored images or even imposter posts, right? Coming from something not trusted. So in news literacy, my goal is to take you all from processing things emotionally, where you form a conclusion based on whether something feels true, to using more rational reasoning and evaluating information based on facts, evidence, and the argument being presented. Understand that bad actors are actively trying to manipulate you into false belief. Propaganda is information that wants to provoke you by using false or distorted images to manipulate your emotions. They're trying to manipulate you emotionally. We see this played out through a number of different propaganda techniques, thanks to the museum. One of these is simplification, making complex issues, things like the coronavirus or 9/11, making them seem more simple than what actually happened. And you see this run all the way into things like division, right? Where in political times in election season, we see a lot of misinformers and bad actors trying to build a wedge between communities and exploit the gap between us and them. An example of this is brought to you by RumorGuard, the News Literacy Project's fact-checking leg that I'll get into more in a minute. This example was a debunked viral rumor that RumorGuard fact-checked. So this image says, is basically portraying the Palestinian activists is removing an American flag and replacing it with the Palestinian flag under the Golden Gate Bridge. But this did not happen. This is not real. This is put into false context because whoever created this photo cropped off what was actually happening, right? They cropped off. The real story is that protesters raised a Palestinian flag as a call for a ceasefire. And if we aren't careful about misinformers, they will prey on things like our natural processes of confirmation bias to manipulate us emotionally. And as we progress through this election season, Another form of propaganda we have to be aware of is pink slime journalism. And this refers to platforms that try to look like a credible news organization, but are funded by partisan groups to provide a skewed perspective of news that falls in line with their agenda. The word is called pink slime because it's supposed to be the same, the same mode of the substance that's used in fast food, like chicken nuggets, so that you can mass produce it, right? It's about this idea of mass producing information, but it's not always quality, right? So pink slime sites are trying to take advantage of the struggling newspaper industry and replace local news sites with just this drivel, right? Just reshare documents that aren't necessarily edited or checked, just resharing things. They claim to cover hyperlocal events, hyperlocal news, but really they're just preying on news deserts, taking advantage of the fact that a paper has shuttered or that it had merged or is no longer in the area. Oftentimes, these sites are created using AI tools, right? And you can tell because they're basic templates, right? They're not really designed with that human feel. They don't really have a uniqueness to them. They're very generic. And most of these are funded by outside companies or partisan groups that have certain financial interests in them. So if we think about pink slime on a national scale, it's becoming a bigger threat, right? In 2020, the New York Times released an investigation into a nationwide pink slime operation. We could see how it evolved over years, going from only a few in 2011 to 46 in 2016 to 1,211 by the time of 2022. So the NY Times released an investigation into this operation and found that the man running this operation is a former TV reporter turned media entrepreneur who was looking to take advantage of the decline of local news. These newspapers, right, appear like local news outlets with names like the Des Moines Sun and the Ann Arbor Time, but they're just designed to look like newspapers, and they were used to push political agendas. So the last thing to think about when you want to be informed while consuming news is to act as a trusted intermediary. So today, fewer people see legacy media and other institutions as trusted intermediaries of complex subjects. So no longer are people listening to their newspapers or sometimes, in some cases, organizations like the World Health Organization because of the harm that, the media has done to these relationships regarding trust. But people have someone they will trust, right? Your uncle who believes in misinformation, if he doesn't believe in government sources and trusted institutions, he probably believes someone is a trusted source. And in most people's lives, they have someone in their personal space that they will trust, right? So many people rely on the observations and statements of this person to navigate what they should believe. So when it comes to your relationship, this type of relationship that you have with someone else, it's important to make sure you're informing yourself so that you can help equip them with accurate information when you're having conversations. Also, remember, please, if there's one thing to think about for this, verify before you amplify. When you encounter misinformation online, stop, slow down, evaluate the source, and think critically about what you're seeing. For more, if you would like to join us in this fight against misinformation, please check out our fact-checking platform, RumorGuard, to learn more about how you can grow your skills to debunk viral rumors and misinformation online. Here on our site at rumorguard.org/join, you can learn more about the different techniques that we use, dig deeper in some of the skills, and give us feedback on how we can improve the platform and maybe some viral rumor that you want debunked. So I know we went a little bit over on time, but I want to make sure that I give space for questions. I see that there is a number of things being discussed in the chat, but I'll look to the Q&A. If there's anything that you want to write down, please please share it in the Q&A feature in the chat. Okay. The first question comes from Rosalind, who says, to diversify my sources, should I also read more right-wing sources on top of left-wing news sources? How do you recommend I go about this so that I don't live in a bubble? Great question. Yes, diversify your news sources. Absolutely. Like I don't want to I don't want to overstate this enough. Like, we want you all to be able to have the skills, the resources, and the knowledge to make credible decisions for yourself. What you decide to read, we want to give you we want to help you be able to evaluate that on your own. So, yes, diversify your sources. That is a great thing to do. I would say read a lot of different things, right? Read things you or other people might consider more right wing. Read things that you or other people might consider more left wing sources. It takes that active approach, right? It takes an active approach to really make sure that you're not living in a news bubble, and to make sure that your algorithms, aren't taking advantage of you, passively scrolling through social media. They'll make a lot of suggestions to you, but it's on you to be active about your news consumption. So simply put, yes. Let's see, good point, algorithms. Rosalind also asks, has there been a trust index developed for various news sources? That is a good question. I'll have to get back to you on that. Please email me this question after this webinar, but I would say that there has been some research into the standards of certain news organizations. There are media bias charts that kind of plot where certain news organizations are from like what we perceive to be their bias. But I don't know if that would count as a trust index. And I wouldn't trust it as far as saying that, certain news organizations need to be on the same evaluation platform as certain partisan sites. But I would say that there are things that the journalism industry is doing to ensure that people can access credible news. And part of that, really, I think a lot of that starts with us, right? Are we news literate? Do we understand what the signs of quality journalism is? I think that's the first step. Tracy asks, where are we going from here? I hope this conversation continues. Well, there will be a lot of opportunities throughout the year for you all to plug in with news literacy. We'll be offering a number of free webinars throughout the rest of the year. Honestly, as we're in a very, very important year for the country, we'll be offering a number of free webinars and trainings for you all to connect with. Okay, awesome. Well, if that's it for the questions, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for being plugged into National News Literacy Week. It is a pleasure and an honor. Before I let you all go today, I want to also remind you all to check out, our next webinar on February 6th, where we go deeper into our information zones, where we can figure out if something is news, opinion, or advertising. Is going to be an amazing webinar. It's going to be in the daytime this time, so that the people who weren't able to get on this webinar, they'll be able to attend. And please, there will be a survey that will be shared with you all. Please try your best to complete the survey. It gives us great feedback on how we can improve our sessions and bring you all the best trainings and webinars possible. Again, thank you all so much for attending this webinar. I hope you are enjoying News Literacy Week like I am. We've had a lot of great events and programs so far. Thank you so much for joining, and please stay in contact if you have any further questions or like to get connected with News Literacy. Thank you so much. Have a good night.